Hey there, church family. Welcome back to another episode of Inspiring Stories from Church History. Now, today's video moves ahead a couple of centuries to discuss some figures who would become quite influential for the Middle Ages, for the Protestant Reformation, and even through to today. Though several of our remaining videos will focus on people who are less well known but who still have powerful stories, today's video focuses on someone indispensable for understanding the history and theology of Christianity, Augustine of Hippo. But before we turn to Augustine, who was from Northern Africa, I'd simply like to point out, as I did in our first video, that the tradition of Christianity in Africa is quite strong, going back not only to the time of Augustine, but even to the original apostles. The same is true for many places throughout the Middle East and South Asia as well, especially considering the fact that Christianity began in the Middle East. A common belief in our secular Western world is that Christianity is a white European religion, since it was often spread alongside colonialism. But in reality, this is anything but the case. Not only do far more Christians live today in the majority world than in the Western world, but historically speaking, Christianity has had a significant presence in these regions since its inception. So in discussing the key figures of the early church, the African fathers are essential. For example, Cyprian of Carthage, who lived around AD 210 to 258, was an influential, although controversial, theologian who wrote much about church unity and church government. The Desert Fathers and Mothers, who resided mostly in Egypt, were the first Christian monastic groups founded in the early 300s, who emphasized the importance of spiritual discipline, reflection, and living in the way of Jesus. Another example is Athanasius of Alexandria, who lived from around AD 296 to 373, who was likely originally from Central Africa and was one of the most important theologians of all church history. He stood in the face of extensive opposition for the truth that Jesus Christ is truly God, rather than merely someone similar to God, almost God, but not in fact God. In the turmoil over the issue, and as different sides gained power, his church exiled him 5 times, and then later called him back each time. And for this reason, later writers called him Athanasius contra mundum, meaning Athanasius against the world. Yet eventually he succeeded in convincing the church of the biblical truth that Jesus Christ is truly God, and we have much of the language of the Nicene Creed as a result of his work. Yet the main figure I want to focus on today is Augustine of Hippo. Augustine would become particularly important for the Protestant reformers who were trying to recover the biblical gospel. Many lost writings of Augustine had recently been recovered just prior to the Reformation, and these helped the reformers as they also worked to interpret the newly recovered original Greek and Hebrew of the scriptures. So Augustine was born around AD 354 in Tagaste, a small town on the northern coast of modern-day Algeria in northern Africa. Growing up, his father was a pagan, which is the technical term for those who worshipped Roman deities, and his mother was a Christian. Augustine, however, wanted nothing to do with either of these religions, but rather simply wanted to live a hedonistic lifestyle marked by mischief as a boy and sexual promiscuity as an adolescent and an adult. When he was 17, he went off to school in the regional capital of Carthage, where he fell in love with his studies for the first time in his life and decided to use them to become famous and well-respected. He eventually became an expert in rhetoric, and during his studies he also converted to a Gnostic sect called Manichaeism. We talked a bit about Gnosticism last time, and Manichaeism shared many of the features we described, including a particular emphasis on dualism, the idea that supreme and equal powers of good and evil are eternally at war in the spiritual realm, and that physical matter is inherently unclean. Well, Augustine became a tutor of rhetoric and of Manichaeism back in his hometown of Tagaste, and though there was conflict between him and his mother Monica over his faith, she continued to pray earnestly for his conversion. They both moved to Carthage when he received a teaching post there, and not long after, Augustine was offered to become a professor in Rome. His mother did not want him to leave, so he lied to her and told her he would stay, but then left for Rome by ship without her knowledge. Augustine worked in Rome for a year, but then he was offered a position as the resident professor of rhetoric for the city of Milan. He decided to take this post, and while in Milan, he began attending the local Christian church in order to hear the famed Bishop Ambrose speak. Ambrose was known to be a brilliant orator, so out of professional interest, Augustine, the professor of rhetoric, went to hear him. Augustine stayed, however, out of interest in the message. Augustine soon left Manichaeism, frustrated with its internal inconsistencies and shallowness, and although he adopted a philosophy popular among Christians of the day known as Neoplatonism, he did not yet convert to Christianity itself. His mother, Monica, found him and convinced him to send away the concubine with whom he had a son. He loved this woman very much, but he had never married her because doing so would have ruined him in Roman society, since she was of a lower class. Yet he did send her away, and as a result of this and the other changes that had recently happened in his life, he was dealing with a great amount of anxiety. One day around this time, he was walking in his garden in the afternoon, thinking about how he seemed unable to overcome his fleshly passions. And suddenly he heard a little child singing a nursery rhyme with the words, take up and read, which rhymes in Latin. He saw the collection of Paul's epistles that he had been reading lying on the nearby table, and he went over and picked it up. And he read the first verse that his eyes fell on. It happened to be Romans 13:13-14. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. Immediately, the doubts vanished from his heart, and he knew that God had called him to salvation by God's grace. Everything about Augustine's life changed after this point. He resigned his post as professor, told Ambrose about his conversion, went off to study in the countryside for 6 months, returned to Milan to be baptized, and then went home to Tagaste in Africa. The deaths of several of those closest to him prompted Augustine to start a monastic group in Tagaste, to spend more time in prayer and Bible study. And in AD 391, he journeyed to the city of Hippo, not far from Tagaste, to see if the bishop there would let him set up an official monastery. Instead, the congregation, who had heard of Augustine's great reputation and knew of his conversion from 5 years prior, pushed him forward to be ordained as a priest. Although he did not desire it and preferred to stay in the seclusion of a monastery, Augustine was made a priest. 5 years later, when the local bishop had died, Augustine rose to the rank of Bishop of Hippo, a post in which he served until his death in the year 430. Now we have all these details about Augustine's life and conversion mostly because he wrote them down for us in a book called The Confessions. Augustine wrote quite a few books. In fact, he was the most prolific author of the ancient world. Alongside his Confessions, some of his most influential works include his books entitled On the Trinity, On Christian Doctrine, and The City of God. Augustine is known as a philosopher, a theologian, a pastor, a preacher, an exegete, and an apologist. He defended the faith against the Manichaeans, showing that God is one being in 3 persons, that Jesus is fully God and fully man, that God's physical creation is good. He defended the faith against a group called the Donatists, who believed that clergy who had faltered under persecution were illegitimate and that no one in their churches was saved. He defended the faith against Pelagianism, led by the British monk Pelagius, which claimed that humans have the ability to follow God perfectly of their own free will, and that divine grace is thus unnecessary. In all these controversies, the church councils ended up siding with Augustine, that his arguments for these things like the primacy of grace and the divine initiative were biblical, unlike those of his opponents. Augustine also defended the faith against the Roman pagans, many of whom were blaming Christians for the fall of Rome, saying that this was the God's punishment for so many in the empire turning away from worshiping them. Augustine argued instead that this was God's judgment for Rome's sins of the past, not for its growing Christian faith. Within all these different roles, Augustine was known primarily as a powerful speaker. Whether he was preaching, pastoring, or writing, this came through. All his books were actually dictated to scribes, which was common in the ancient world. When Augustine died of fever 3 months into the Vandal invaders' siege of Hippo, the man who played a key role in preserving and indexing his writings wrote in his biography of Augustine that reading Augustine was beneficial, but it was nothing compared to hearing him speak live. For example, when preaching, Augustine would often start busting out rhymes. He usually preached either in Latin or in Punic, depending on the native language of his hearers, but regardless, he would often break into extemporaneous rhyming or use parallel phrases. For this reason, some scholars have referred to Augustine as an ancient rapper. And you might wonder, did the church ever talk back to him? And the answer is, all the time. In fact, sometimes they got a little too rowdy with all their cheering and hallelujahs, which could frustrate Augustine a little bit depending on what type of point he was trying to make. But in short, Augustine's life and ministry provides us with an encouraging example of Christian faith and of God's transforming grace at work in a life. Some would say he went from being a rebel to being a bishop. I prefer to say that he went from frat boy to Christian rapper and pastor. His writings still have so much to teach us today. He places a key emphasis on faith, hope, and love, as well as on divine grace. He also teaches valuable insights on culture and on living for God in the world. These are things that all of us still need. So, blessings on you all this week. Sorry for the length of this video. There was a lot to cover today, but all of our remaining videos should be much shorter than this. I'll post some discussion questions again, as usual. You know the drill by now. And the bibliography is in the video notes. I'm praying that you all are encouraged by these stories to keep living out the faith, and I'll see you all next time.